The courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal experts, and curious onlookers filled every available seat, all waiting for what was expected to be a routine sentencing. The accused, Richard Holloway, a former high-profile businessman, stood at the defense table, dressed in an expensive suit that barely concealed his arrogance. His cold, piercing eyes scanned the room as though he still controlled everything around him. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Markham, a seasoned and respected judge, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file before her. Richard had been convicted of multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and intimidation, but his sentence had yet to be finalized. Despite his guilt, many in the public still saw him as a powerful figure, someone too wealthy and influential to face real consequences. Prosecutors had asked for 25 years in prison, arguing that Holloway's crimes had ruined the lives of hundreds. His defense, in contrast, pushed for a reduced sentence, claiming that Richard had shown remorse and was willing to pay restitution. Judge Markham had heard similar arguments before, but she intended to weigh the facts carefully before making her decision. Then, the moment that changed everything happened. A woman in the audience suddenly stood up. Her voice shook with emotion but was firm and unwavering. "Your Honor, you don't understand," she said, stepping forward despite the murmurs and the security guards moving toward her. "He is a monster." A heavy silence fell over the room. Judge Markham froze, her hands gripping the gavel tightly. Her expression, once neutral, suddenly paled, as if the very air had been sucked out of the courtroom. Something about the woman's words had hit her like a thunderbolt. It was not just shock. It was fear. Who was this woman? And why did Judge Markham react as though she had seen a ghost? Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The bailiff instinctively moved toward the woman, but Judge Markham raised a hand to stop him. Her face was still pale, her fingers trembling slightly as she set down her gavel. "Who are you?" the judge asked, her voice softer than usual but laced with a tension no one could ignore. The woman swallowed hard before speaking. "My name is Emily Carter," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. "And I know exactly what Richard Holloway is capable of, because I survived him." Richard Holloway, who had been standing stiffly at the defense table, suddenly smirked. Cold, knowing smirk. It was subtle, but Judge Markham saw it, and it sent a shiver down her spine. "This is highly irregular," the defense attorney objected, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, this woman is not part of the proceedings. If she has a statement, it should have been filed properly." "Sit down," Judge Markham interrupted, her voice suddenly firm. The room fell silent again. Emily Carter took a shaky breath. "Your Honor, please. If you sentence him lightly, more people will suffer. You don't understand the things he's done that weren't even brought to trial." The tension in the courtroom thickened. Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her gaze remained locked on the judge. She had come here with a purpose, and she would not leave until she was heard. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she dropped the bombshell that made the entire courtroom gasp. "Judge Markham, you know what he did, because he did it to someone you loved." The judge visibly flinched. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time in her long, decorated career, Judge Markham felt her authority slipping away, not because of a legal loophole or a corrupt system, but because of the ghosts of her own past. The courtroom fell deathly silent. Judge Markham stared at Emily Carter, her face betraying a rare moment of personal vulnerability. "What are you talking about?" she finally asked, but her voice lacked its usual commanding presence. Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides as she stepped closer. "You remember my sister, don't you, Judge Markham? You remember Rachel Carter?" Judge Markham's breath hitched. The name was a hammer to her chest. The walls of the courtroom seemed to shrink around her. Rachel Carter, a name she had tried to bury deep in her memory. 20 years ago, Rachel had been a bright, promising young journalist. Ambitious, fearless, determined to expose the corruption in the city. But then, she disappeared. One day, she had walked into a high-profile case, following a lead on corporate crime. And she was never seen again. Her body was never found. Her case remained unsolved. But one name had always lingered in whispers behind the tragedy: Richard Holloway. Judge Markham's throat went dry. She had always suspected, but there had never been enough evidence. No one dared speak against Holloway. Until now. "You know the truth," Emily said, her voice a mix of sorrow and fury. "You know Richard Holloway killed her. And now, you're about to let him walk away with a slap on the wrist." Judge Markham gripped the edges of her bench. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Richard Holloway's smirk widened ever so slightly. He knew exactly what he had done. And now it was clear that Emily Carter knew too. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, journalists frantically taking notes. The defense attorney looked stunned, his carefully crafted arguments crumbling before his eyes. Judge Markham inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. She had a choice. She could maintain judicial neutrality, ignore the painful truth, and proceed as though this was just another sentencing. Or she could do what was right. Slowly, she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Holloway's. "Richard Holloway," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "It seems we have more to discuss before I pass judgment." A ripple of shock and anticipation spread through the courtroom. For the first time, Richard Holloway's smirk faltered. Richard Holloway's smirk vanished. For the first time since the trial began, a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Your Honor," his defense attorney interjected, rising from his chair. "This is absurd. Miss Carter is making baseless accusations. If she had anything relevant to say, she should have testified during the trial." Judge Markham ignored him. Her gaze remained fixed on Holloway, her mind racing. The past she had tried to forget was now staring her in the face. Emily Carter took another step forward, her voice steady despite the raw emotion burning in her eyes. "You know what he did," she said, her words slicing through the air. "Rachel was investigating Holloway's illegal businesses. She told me everything before she disappeared." The entire courtroom hung onto every word. "She told me about the money laundering, the bribes, the threats. She was close to exposing him. And then one night she was gone. Just like that." The tension in the room thickened like a storm cloud. The jury members sat rigid, their expressions dark with realization. Even the prosecution, which had focused only on financial crimes, looked shaken. Judge Markham's fingers curled into a fist. She remembered Rachel Carter. Rachel had been brilliant, young, and fearless. A woman who had gotten too close to the truth. Judge Markham had met her once, just weeks before she disappeared. And now, after all these years, Emily stood before her, demanding justice. But how? There was no physical evidence. No official case against Holloway for murder. The legal system had failed Rachel once. Could it fail her again? Judge Markham's eyes flickered back to Holloway. His face had returned to calculated coldness, but there was something else there now, something uneasy. He knew he was losing control. Slowly, the judge leaned forward. "Miss Carter, what exactly are you saying?" Emily swallowed, then spoke the words that sent a shockwave through the room. "I have proof." Collective gasp filled the courtroom. Richard Holloway's jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. For the first time, he looked afraid. Judge Markham sat up straighter. "What kind of proof?" Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. "Rachel was smart," she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of conviction. "She knew Holloway would come for her, so she recorded everything. She hid the files. And I found them." The room erupted into murmurs. The prosecution snapped to attention. Even the journalists stopped scribbling, their hands frozen over their notepads. Judge Markham's heart pounded. If this was real, if Rachel had left behind evidence. Richard Holloway stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. "Your Honor, this is a farce," he shouted. "This woman is lying." But Judge Markham saw it now, the panic in his eyes, the fear behind his rage. She slowly exhaled, then turned to the bailiff. "Take that drive into evidence." The bailiff strode forward, carefully taking the USB drive from Emily Carter's trembling hands. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, murmurs growing louder as people realized what had just happened. Judge Markham inhaled deeply, forcing herself to maintain her composure. The weight of the moment was crushing. If this evidence was real, it could change everything. "Miss Carter," she said, keeping her tone even, "are you stating under oath that this drive contains information related to Richard Holloway's crimes, including possible evidence of murder?" Emily's voice did not waver. "Yes, Your Honor. Rachel hid this for years. I only found it last month, right before this trial started." Across the room, Richard Holloway's face twisted with fury. He turned to his attorney, whispering something in a low, urgent tone. The lawyer's expression was grim. "Your Honor." The defense attorney scrambled to regain control. "This is highly irregular. This drive has not been authenticated or submitted as evidence before today. We cannot allow unverified claims to." Judge Markham lifted a hand. Enough. Her patience was razor-thin. She had spent years presiding over cases where justice bent in favor of the powerful. She had seen men like Holloway manipulate the system time and time again. "Not today. We will take a recess," she announced, "and the contents of this drive will be reviewed immediately." The court erupted. The prosecution was already on their feet, demanding access to the drive. Journalists rushed out of the room to report the breaking news. The jurors whispered amongst themselves. Richard Holloway's calm mask finally cracked. His hands clenched into fists, and for a brief moment, his mask of control slipped, revealing something raw and dangerous beneath. Judge Markham noticed, and she knew without a doubt that Emily Carter was telling the truth. As the judge stood to exit the courtroom, she caught sight of Holloway's expression. His smirk was gone. For the first time in his life, he looked like a man who knew he was about to lose. The courtroom was cleared for recess, but the tension never left the air. Judge Markham retreated to her chambers with the prosecution team, a forensic analyst, and key court officials. The USB drive sat ominously on the table, holding the potential to dismantle Richard Holloway's empire and finally bring justice for Rachel Carter. Emily Carter stood nearby, her hands tightly clasped together. She had spent years waiting for this moment, and now, everything depended on what they were about to uncover. The forensic analyst inserted the drive into a secure, court-authorized laptop. Seconds later, a folder titled, "For Emily," appeared. A hush fell over the room. Judge Markham swallowed. Rachel knew, she thought. She knew something would happen to her. The analyst clicked the folder open. Inside were several encrypted files, alongside a single video file labeled with the date of Rachel's disappearance. "Play it," Judge Markham ordered. The screen flickered, and suddenly, Rachel Carter appeared. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but her determination burned through the screen. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it." Rachel's voice trembled slightly but remained steady. "And it means Richard Holloway got to me." Judge Markham felt a chill run down her spine. "I've uncovered proof that Holloway has been running a criminal network far worse than anyone realizes," Rachel continued. "Bribery, extortion, money laundering, those are just the surface. But the worst of it? The people who cross him don't just lose their jobs or their businesses." She swallowed hard. "They disappear." Gasps filled the room. Rachel turned the camera slightly, revealing a stack of documents. Printouts of emails, bank transactions, and most damning of all, a signed contract authorizing a hit on an unnamed journalist. "He's had people killed," Rachel whispered, her face full of fear. "And I think I'm next." Emily covered her mouth, trying to suppress a sob. Judge Markham's hands clenched into fists. She had sentenced criminals before, but never had she seen such a cold-blooded admission of murder. Then, the most chilling part of the video played. Rachel froze, her eyes darting towards something off-camera. "Oh God! He found me," she whispered. The video cut to static. A heavy silence filled the room. Judge Markham looked up, her expression unreadable. But inside, she was seething. "Issue an immediate arrest warrant for Richard Holloway on charges of conspiracy to commit murder." Emily let out a sob of relief. Justice was finally coming. The weight of the video's final moments hung in the air like a storm cloud. Judge Markham's breath was steady, but her pulse pounded like a war drum. "Issue the warrant. Now," she repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. The prosecutor snapped into action, calling law enforcement on the spot. Within moments, officers were on their way to the courthouse to place Richard Holloway under immediate arrest, not just for financial crimes, but for murder. Emily Carter sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. The truth about Rachel was finally out. No more cover-ups, no more silence. But there was still one person who wasn't ready to surrender. Richard Holloway. Back in the courtroom, chaos had erupted. Holloway stood at the defense table, his lawyer frantically arguing, but it was clear control had slipped from his grasp. As the double doors swung open, officers marched in, their hands resting on their holsters. The lead officer, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Richard Holloway, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice," she announced, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. For a moment, Holloway didn't move. His once arrogant demeanor seemed frozen, like a statue on the verge of cracking. Then, he did something no one expected. He lunged for Emily Carter. A scream tore through the room as Holloway's hands reached toward her neck, his face twisted with fury. "You little..." Before he could finish, a deafening sound filled the air, the cocking of multiple guns. The officers surrounded him instantly, weapons drawn. "Back off, Holloway," one of them barked. Emily, her eyes wide with terror, scrambled back, gasping for breath. Holloway stood frozen, his chest heaving with rage. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere left to run. Slowly, he raised his hands. The officer closest to him stepped forward, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists with a sharp metallic click. For the first time in his life, Richard Holloway was powerless. And as the officers led him toward the door, Judge Markham spoke one final time. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice calm but filled with iron will, "you will never walk free again." Holloway's expression twisted with hatred, but deep inside, he knew it was over. The click of the handcuffs around Richard Holloway's wrists sent a ripple of energy through the courtroom. The monster was finally caught. But Judge Markham knew this was just the beginning. As the officers escorted Holloway out, reporters rushed toward the courtroom doors, scrambling to break the story. The once mighty businessman, who had controlled boardrooms and bank accounts with a mere nod, was now just another criminal being led to his fate. Emily Carter was still shaking, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. Judge Markham looked at her. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice softer than before, "I know this doesn't bring Rachel back," but she made sure her voice was heard. "Because of her, justice will be served." Emily's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded. "She always said the truth would come out, no matter what," Emily whispered. Judge Markham's gaze hardened as she turned to the prosecution team. "We move immediately. I want that drive backed up in 3 places, authenticated by forensic experts, and entered into the system for a new case. This man is going away for life." The lead prosecutor nodded. "We're on it, Your Honor. And with this evidence, we may even uncover more victims. This isn't just about Rachel. This is bigger." Judge Markham sighed. "It always is." She knew men like Holloway didn't operate alone. There were people who had helped him, covered for him, profited from his crimes. This case was about to explode into something far more dangerous. But for the first time, Holloway wasn't in control anymore. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Markham remained seated for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. 20 years ago, she had failed Rachel Carter. Today, she didn't. With a steady breath, she rose from her chair. Justice had only just begun. The news of Richard Holloway's arrest for conspiracy to commit murder spread like wildfire. Television screens, online news articles, and social media exploded with the shocking revelation. The once revered businessman was now a prime suspect in a decades-old disappearance. But Judge Markham knew this was far from over. As she stepped into her chambers, the lead prosecutor, David Langston, was already waiting with a folder in hand. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with urgency. "Your Honor, we have a problem," Langston said, shutting the door behind her. Judge Markham exhaled slowly, already sensing what was coming. "How bad?" Langston handed her the folder. Inside were documents, financial statements, and email exchanges, all pointing to a much larger conspiracy. Holloway didn't just launder money. He funded entire networks of corruption. Police officers, judges, politicians, you name it, he had them in his pocket, Langston explained. That's why Rachel Carter was a threat. She wasn't just onto him. She was onto his entire empire. Judge Markham felt a chill crawl up her spine. If this was true, it meant Holloway's influence didn't stop at business fraud or hired assassinations. It meant that there were still people out there, powerful people, who had just as much to lose as he did. And they would do anything to keep the truth buried. "Does Emily know?" she asked, closing the folder. Langston shook his head. "Not yet. But she's in danger, Your Honor. If Holloway had Rachel killed to silence her, you can bet whoever is still out there won't hesitate to do the same to Emily." Judge Markham clenched her jaw. "Not on my watch." She stood up, pressing the intercom. "Get court security. I want Emily Carter placed under immediate protective custody. No exceptions." Langston nodded, but his expression remained grim. "And you, Judge?" he asked. "If Holloway had people in the system, they might come for you too." Judge Markham stiffened, but she didn't waver. "Let them try," she said. "I've spent my whole life fighting men like Holloway. I'm not stopping now." Langston smirked. "Remind me never to cross you, Judge." She picked up the folder one more time, scanning the names inside. She recognized some of them. Corrupt officials, crooked law enforcement, even a former judge. They had protected Holloway for years, and now they were next. As she set the folder down, she knew the real war was only beginning. Judge Markham sat at her desk, staring at the damning list of names inside the folder. Corrupt officials, law enforcement officers, even judges. All of them had been part of Holloway's network of power and silence. This wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption. And she had just become the biggest threat to them all. A sharp knock on her office door snapped her from her thoughts. One of the court's security officers, a tall, stern-faced man, stepped inside. "Your Honor, we've placed Emily Carter under protective custody. She's being moved to a secure location with U.S. Marshals. No leaks, no outside access." Judge Markham nodded, relief washing over her. Emily was safe for now, but there was still one more piece left to play. The next morning, Holloway was brought back into the courtroom, this time wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of a designer suit. His face was hard, but his eyes were burning with rage. He wasn't used to losing. Judge Markham took her seat. The courtroom was packed. The world was watching. "Mr. Holloway," she began, her voice steady, "you are now being charged not only with financial crimes but with conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. Due to new evidence provided to this court, you are now under investigation for multiple disappearances linked to your operations." A wave of gasps rippled through the room. Richard Holloway's jaw clenched. His lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but it was clear. There was no escaping this. Then Holloway did something no one expected. He laughed. It was cold, empty, full of arrogance. "You think you've won, Judge?" he said, leaning forward. "You don't even know what you've stepped into. You think taking me down ends this? This city belongs to people like me. People you don't even know exist." Judge Markham held his gaze, unshaken. "Then I'll find them," she said. "One by one. I will burn down everything you built." A flicker of something dangerous flashed in Holloway's eyes. Fear. Because for the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't dealing with someone he could buy, threaten, or control. Judge Markham wasn't afraid of him, and that scared him more than anything. The verdict. 2 hours later, Judge Markham returned to deliver the sentence that would end Holloway's reign forever. "Richard Holloway, for your crimes, including fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Emily Carter sobbed with relief. And Richard Holloway? For the first time, his smirk was gone. The once mighty businessman, who had controlled lives, ruined families, and silenced those who stood against him, was now nothing more than a prisoner. Justice had finally been served. But for Judge Markham, her fight wasn't over. Because now, she was going after everyone who had enabled him. Epilogue. The war on corruption begins. 1 week later, Judge Eleanor Markham held a press conference. Standing before a sea of reporters, she held up the list of names from Holloway's network. "This is bigger than one man," she said into the microphones. "This is about an entire system that has allowed corruption, abuse of power, and murder to thrive in silence." She turned to the cameras, her voice unwavering. "That silence ends today." And with that, she vowed Richard Holloway may have been the first, but he wouldn't be the last.